Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and last Saturday I did it. I went and I saw the movie Disclosure Day in the cinema. And tonight I'm going to be giving you my review of that movie. I'm going to be particularly focusing on the way that this film is informed by the current disclosure moment in the real world of the Department of War releasing its documents and other related things. And I'm also going to be talking about how this movie is really situated in that and is a part of that process. And I'm going to be looking at some of the ways that it is part of disclosure. I'm going to be looking at some of the themes that it covers that are related to that issue, and then reaching my own conclusions about what I thought of the movie. And just off the bat, what are some general things I can say about it? Well, look, it wasn't a great movie, okay? Other people have seen it and they've said it's definitely not Steven Spielberg's best work, and I have to agree. However, I don't think that the movie deserves a lot of the hate that it's been getting. There are a lot of creators out there who have been absolutely destroying the movie, saying it's the worst thing that's ever been shown in the movies in 10 years. Some bits were cheesy, and it was a bit of a repetitive and not very enthralling plot line, which revolved a lot around cars driving to various places. But there were other things in the movie that were reasonably well done and were an important contribution to the discussion on disclosure. But people have just not appreciated that for what it is because they haven't understood it. I've seen a lot of this in the reviews. Like, one thing that I see is Christians getting angry about Steven Spielberg having said, oh, this is going to challenge the faith of many Christians. And then they go on this tirade about demons and paving the way for the Antichrist and how it's all blasphemy and it's about mockeries of the miracles that God can create and that only human beings should be considered God's special creation, rah, rah, rah. But then if you look at the actual movie, it presents lots of different perspectives on how disclosure could affect religion. And some of those might be seen as Christianity getting undermined in some way, but other perspectives that it presents would see the faith adapting to that and incorporating the disclosure of non-human intelligence into its existing framework without the fundamentals of the belief system being disturbed too much. So I don't think that it's quite as simplistic as this is attacking Christianity, this is paving the way for some kind of false revelation to come into the world. And I think maybe Steven Spielberg was being a bit sensationalist when he presented the movie in terms of how much it would disrupt Christianity. And there are a lot of Christians who have taken that way too seriously. But I certainly don't think that he deserves to be criticised for the way that he has treated the issue of the interaction between religion and disclosure, except maybe there's a little too much ambiguity, as with some of the other things in the film. And then some reviewers criticised it because, isn't this a corny idea that the alien appears as a bird and then that leads to this person having experiences? So we'll start there. I think that that's an unfair criticism that people have had. And I don't know what some of these movie critics were expecting. Maybe they think that if there's a portrayal of aliens in a sci-fi film, it has to involve like flashing colours and lasers shooting everywhere and a giant, big, futuristic looking spaceship, and that sound effect happens every 5 seconds that it goes like that. And anything else is like not interesting enough. And I think that's an unfortunate position to have, because I think what Steven Spielberg has tried to do is show contact with NHI in a realistic way. And that often does take the form of, like, you see an animal or you see something which seems to behave in an odd way, and it kind of puts you in this uncanny headspace, and then you're more receptive to messages and signs and synchronicities, and it leads you somewhere, and one thing leads to another. That often is the way that experiences unfold. So although it's not as interesting as seeing like two transformers fighting each other or something like that, it's actually more faithful with what alien or NHI interaction with the human species often looks like. The other director I can think of who has presented high strangeness in a way that is still got a kind of realism to it in a weird kind of a way is David Lynch in Twin Peaks. And in fact, Diana Pasulka says that Twin Peaks is the most accurate representation of the phenomenon that she's ever seen. So perhaps there's something to that as well. Season 3 of Twin Peaks, a lot of people were critical of that and said that it didn't make any sense compared to the other two seasons. I enjoyed season 3. I enjoyed all of it. But, you know, I am a little bit weird, in case you haven't noticed. So maybe that's why I liked the third season. Or maybe it was just good, and some people just didn't get it. But I'm definitely not putting Disclosure Day on the same level as Twin Peaks, because it's not. But I'm just saying that there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding here in the way people are approaching the film to critique it. And another thing that gets critiqued in a lot of these reviews that I've seen is the way that Emily Blunt's character, Margaret Fairchild, and this is a spoiler alert, is able to assume the form of loved ones of different people, and how this allows her to pass through armed guards or armed soldiers, like she's parting the Red Sea, and avoiding a escalation into violence. And a similar sort of thing happens at the end of the film. Like, it looks like there's going to be a showdown or a shootout, and then something happens, and you know, the antagonists just completely back down. And this has been criticised as something which is really poorly written plot. But I think here again, people are missing something really important, because if you think about it, so the antagonists of the film are, some people are saying they're a government organisation. I think what's really being pointed to is some kind of private interest that gets black money that is continuing these kinds of investigations into NHIs. So they're the antagonists anyway, very militaristic, very aggressive, repressive force that's trying to stop the truth from coming out. You've got the protagonists who are trying to get the truth out to humanity, and ultimately, in a weird kind of a way, working together with the NHIs, who represent a higher power of sorts, who are encouraging humanity's evolution. And so if you've got a contest between those two, it actually makes sense that when there's a pivotal moment where the NHI or the human beings through whom the NHIs are working get the upper hand, that the muscle of this antagonistic force, human force, would back off if they know what they're really dealing with. Because there's not an equal power balance there. You know, there's a game of chess that's happening between the deep state, whether it's private or government interests on Earth, and these NHIs. And we're trying to outsmart them, we're trying to strategize, we're trying to maneuver, not us, but, you know, the people that supposedly represent us. And they're playing an ordinary game of chess. And on the other side of the board, the NHIs are playing 3D chess, and they have access to that dimension, literally and metaphorically, that we don't have access to. And so, of course, they're going to best us every time. And so when you're faced with that kind of power imbalance, if you go in guns blazing, you're going to get completely squashed. So you have to be willing to know your limits and cooperate and negotiate with the other side and preserving your position as much as possible, which means backing off when necessary. And so it makes sense that that's what, to preserve their own survival. It makes sense that, the soldiers that work for Wardex, if they truly understand to some extent the phenomena that they're dealing with, they would back off in situations like that. So again, I think that criticism is unwarranted. But yeah, you're going to be disappointed if you're looking for like two Transformers fighting each other. That's not the kind of sci-fi movie that this is. And so I think that brings a kind of realism to the discussion on our interactions with NHIs, particularly now that information is coming out about what that really looks like. And there were other things that were mentioned in the movie that are a match with the way that contact with NHIs, the things that are reported by experiences, how all of these things play out in real life. So for example, the two main characters who have these abilities to channel information from a higher source unlocked their abilities when they were around the age of 10, and they went onto a ship and the NHIs did something to them to unlock those abilities, did something to their head. This is something that is widely reported by experiences. Particularly, I've been looking a lot into the mantids recently, and this is something that features quite a bit in those kinds of experiences. Brain scans, dropping information into people's heads, giving them spiritual abilities and so on. So that's something that's corroborated by real accounts. And then fluidity or uncertainty about whether this is a dream or whether this is something that's actually happening to them, and how that becomes foggy. We see that repeated in a number of reported abduction experiences. The fact that there's these alien artifacts that can allow a link to be formed with these NHIs, and how that can often look like something spiritual, and the fact that some of these artifacts might also have implications in terms of energy sources, all tracks with what's actually been revealed over many years about what the government knows about UAP and NHIs. There's of course the crashes of UFOs and the recovery of alien bodies, dead and alive, crop circles, downloads, which I've already mentioned, and this idea of passengers that gets mentioned. Emily Blunt's character in particular, Margaret, is referred to as a passenger. And so there's this idea of the separation between some kind of consciousness, whether it's hers or an NHI's, and her body is almost like a vessel. And this is similar to a statement that Bob Lazar has made in an interview about human beings being containers. So again, there's something to that. The movie covers remote viewing, which is an underrated part of the whole discussion of the UAP space and government programs and black programs to look into it. But we see that featured in the film. Colin Firth's character, the main antagonist, Noah, is able to do this and uses his powers for evil. But one thing that I found interesting and a bit disappointing about the way that remote viewing is presented in Disclosure Day is that it's only ever done with the help of one of these alien artifacts. And so it gives less agency to human beings and downplays our latent ability to do that just by ourselves. We don't necessarily need the NHIs to help us to do that. I thought that was an interesting choice, because if Spielberg knew about all the other stuff, surely he would have known more about remote viewing. But you can reach your own conclusions about that choice by the director. We got references to the disclosure process itself, a whole bunch of footage of things being released to the public, into the public domain, and people's reactions to that. And this is really interesting. So a lot of those videos were the same kind of format as the disclosure that we've got this year from the Department of War. A little bit grainy, black and white infrared footage of stuff flying over the ocean and doing other things. But Disclosure Day, the movie, was filmed in 2025 and filming finished in 2025. The first release of the UAP disclosure files was early 2026, this year. So Steven Spielberg must have known what the government was planning, and he must have willingly coordinated the release of this film with them to be part of that overall messaging that the US government is trying to give us about disclosure. And another thing that's interesting on that front as well is the fact that a time of war is depicted, and there's people going to the petrol station and panic buying petrol at the petrol station. And again, this was filmed in 2025 and finished filming in 2025, and then everything that happened with the Strait of Hormuz happened early this year. So the government knew that that was coming, and Spielberg knew because the government knew. So we just see how all of these big world events are planned to some extent. But anyway, I'm going on a bit of a tangent now. There was other stuff I wanted to talk about. We get a brief look at the Roswell wreckage. Not the real Roswell wreckage, but a reference to it. And interestingly, the camera pans past a bit of the wreckage that has strange symbols on it, which is a feature of the real Roswell wreckage, something I've spoken about before on my channel. So it was interesting that there was a homage to that in particular, to do with Roswell. One thing that the film did, which I haven't really seen very often in films about alien contact, is the way the NHIs were the ones sort of running the show. They were the ones who were determining how disclosure would happen, and they were the ones setting things in motion to make that happen, and almost like choreographing events by activating the right people at the right times so that their life would turn out a certain way and they'd be exactly where they need to be to make change happen years down the track. And playing this long game of putting people in place, activating them, giving them these extrasensory abilities so they can find each other, and everything is sort of falling into place beautifully and so intricately that there's nothing really that the deep state can do to stop it. Again, they're playing 2D chess, the NHIs are playing 3D chess. And it was nice to see that, as I've reflected on my own experiences and the experiences of others around me that I know who have also experienced things, and how we all find each other and how everything fits together. Things just happen at the right time, and people enter your life at the right time for big things to happen, and then the way that happens with multiple people in your life being at the right time for you to learn this or be directed towards that, and then it's all leading somewhere. It's like there's a big storyboard if you zoom out far enough, and we just see what's immediately in front of us, but somebody has planned it all out. That's the sense that I get myself in how all of this is happening, and it's the way that it was portrayed in the film as well, and it gives the power over disclosure to the NHIs themselves rather than to the government, which I also think is probably the way that it's going in the real world. I think that they've through people they've created enough ripples of disturbance to then force the hand of the government to have to disclose this stuff, and that's what we're seeing now. But it's still being as staged managed as it possibly can be by those shadowy forces that have been the gatekeepers all this time. But there's other things at play besides just shadowy conspiracies within our own earthly governments. But there's all these things that are covered, that are echoed in the real disclosure that's happening, and that seems to be the main reason for this movie. More than entertainment value or anything else, it's about a certain kind of message being given to the public, And it is very obvious that a message is being pushed, and it's not subtle at all, because I think Spielberg was trying to reach as many people as possible, and so to some extent he's trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator, so the message is very obvious, and perhaps the reason why other parts of the movie fall flat is because there was so much of an emphasis on really pushing the message. But some of those messages were surprising, or perhaps not, given the events of the last year or so. But one thing in particular was this religious aspect that was being tied in. So there was like this struggle set up between traditional religion and the beliefs that humanity would hold after disclosure, and like the way that disclosure of non-human intelligence would challenge religion. And it was surprising how much this was emphasized in the movie, again and again, the interaction between religion and the phenomenon. But of course, that's the direction that things have been moving in for at least a year now, if not longer. And again, Spielberg would have to have known that in advance in making this movie. It's not as simplistic as it's been presented, like this is going to challenge Christianity and all of this. There's multiple opinions that are presented as to how disclosure might affect religion. So on the one hand, it's presented as challenging mainstream religion, because suddenly there is something that seems more real than God, that has God-like powers, so it could become like the new gods. And there are certain people who have the instinct of worshipping the phenomenon when that's not really what it is. And the movie makes no... I don't think that the movie says that we should be worshipping NHIs. In some sense, it presents that approach to them as inappropriate, which I think is the correct thing to say about that. But then there's another alternative which is presented, which is, well, maybe the Catholic Church will say there's nothing that says that God can't create other earths with other people on them, and so it doesn't really challenge anything. And it's not clear which way humanity goes when disclosure happens, because you don't actually see what happens after disclosure, which is a bit annoying. But I think how religion was dealt with in the film was done tastefully. There are some really disrespectful things in mainstream media that have been done towards religion in the last 10 years, and this is certainly not one of them. I don't think it deserves to be put in the same bucket. For one thing, there's this tacit acknowledgement at one point that without a higher power, society falls apart at the seams, which would be very consistent with traditional religion, but flies in the face of what all the postmodern secular propaganda that we've been force-fed for the past 20 years has told us about society, that we don't need any of that, and that there's no meaning anyway, and there's just your truth and that's it. So that was a refreshing thing to be seen, to be acknowledged in a film, quite frankly. And I think that when the love interest of the Daniel character, who is a former nun, is in a power struggle with the remote viewing antagonist of Colin Firth's character, I think that the way that religion is treated in that scene is very respectful. Because if you notice, she's the only one who has the mental fortitude to withstand the psychic assaults of this character. No other character stands up to him like that. And she gets the strength to do that from her belief in Christ, represented by her holding the crucifix as the antagonist Noah holds his NHI artifact. And ultimately, that former nun character plays an important role in the resolution of the film. So if you actually look at how it plays out, Jesus wins in the end against the remote viewing deep state antagonist, who almost plays like a tempting Satan role when he's projecting his consciousness to that other character. And much of what he does when he's remote viewing is similar to possession. I don't think it was disrespectful the way that was done. There were other things which alluded maybe to demonic possession, like the spontaneous speaking of new languages and knowing things. But of course, the Holy Spirit can also confer those kinds of powers to people. So I don't necessarily think it was an angelic or demonic form of spirituality that was being promoted in the form of the NHIs. And yeah, the big message of the NHIs was that empathy is like a force, and the next stage in human evolution is to acknowledge empathy and live by empathy. You know, you could interpret that as a very Christian message if you wanted. It's very similar to the idea of love thy neighbor as you love yourself. So again, not disrespectful, I don't think. And any Christian who thinks that it is clearly overreacting. And in fact, the angels that gave me the communications in the Voces Caelesti told me something very similar, actually, about the role of empathy in human evolution as a force of the universe, as well as just being an emotion. And I'll put a verse up on the screen later on for reference. For those of you who have the book, and those of you who don't, I'm still selling it. There's still an Amazon link that you can follow. I'll include it in the description of this video below. There's just a few other things I want to talk about in my review. Let's talk about the aliens in the film, shall we? This was one of the things that, to me, well, there were some aspects of it that I liked, which I think are helpful addition to the discussion about the nature of these beings, namely the fact that they can assume a form other than what they are to achieve their goals. But then when you see their true form, and here's another spoiler alert, although not really, because you've probably seen the trailers, but their true form is the Greys. And I've got a couple of problems with this. First of all, the Greys are not empathetic at all. In fact, they have no feelings, and they're quite scary and quite cruel, actually, in a lot of people's accounts. Certainly not something you would want to look to as a higher power of any sort, in terms of what the destiny of the human race should be. So I don't like the way that the Greys were the big, you know, advanced civilization behind all of the NHI contact. The other thing as well about Greys is it's just a really tired, overused and kind of crappy concept for an alien now. And I know that there are real reports of Greys, but I mean, there's so many other things that you could explore. There's all this stuff about the mantids that we're beginning to understand now, and our understanding of the mantid beings is only going to increase now that Professor David Luke, Dr. Sam Gandy and Samantha Treasure at the University of Greenwich are doing a study into the mantids and mantid encounters. That's going to be a huge thing that increases our knowledge of that side of the phenomenon. So Spielberg could have spoken about mantids. He could have spoken about the sentient plasmoids. David Grush just got up in front of the Capitol and said there's sentient plasmoids. That's a hell of a concept for an alien. Instead, we're stuck in the concept that we had 30 years ago that's just been so overused now. And, you know, and we haven't moved on from it in 30 years. And if you think about how long ago the 90s was, and then you think about the same amount of time back in time, and what aliens looked like then, like, you know, the spacemen from Mars who have green skin and pointy ears, and then that became cringe and we stopped doing it and we came up with better concepts, but we haven't come up with better concepts for the aliens, even though there are a whole bunch of better concepts to draw from. And particularly a director like Spielberg, you would have thought, would be competent enough to explore something like that. But maybe things have changed, I don't know. But yeah, I was just really disappointed in the final reveal of the aliens, and you know, it was like something out of Men in Black with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. You know, a very old, dated movie and not a particularly serious one. But the concept for the aliens was not dissimilar. So that really, I actually, in the scene at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, where they reveal this important alien that's kind of behind a lot of stuff, I actually started to chuckle in the cinema. I was like chuckling to myself as I was watching it. So yeah, needless to say, I was not awestruck by what I saw in that particular aspect of the movie. And yeah, while the movie doesn't say that we should worship them as the new gods, the NHIs that is, it kind of veers close to that at times, in that some people will react that way, and that can be dangerous if it's not done right. And I think one idea that could have been explored more was the fact that these beings are not that different from us. It's just that they're more developed than us, and so maybe instead of just some people going on as before, or some people having their beliefs shattered, or some people worshipping them as the NHIs as gods, maybe we could have other people who interpreted the phenomenon as like an older sibling that had gone along further in life, that they could look up to as a role model and aspire to be more like, so that it's got a more affirmative effect on human agency and furthering human agency. But so again, there's like this conspicuous absence of an interpretation of the phenomenon that gives human beings more agency. That's at least twice that's happened. So interesting to note, particularly when you think about how Spielberg was clearly working with the government in their disclosure efforts in making this film, and there's clearly some kind of effort to stage manage what is now inevitable, which is the disclosure of the presence of non-human intelligence on Earth. And there were other messages of the film that were really not that impressive. Like, for example, it made the mainstream media seem as important now as they were like 20 years ago. The world has moved on since then. The world has lost its trust in mainstream media, and more people are watching YouTube now than streaming Disney Plus. So that wasn't really reflected in the film. That reality wasn't reflected in the film. If the NHIs were going to choose a platform to spread a message to the human race for their future evolution, they'd choose a different type of platform. It wouldn't be, CNN or NBC or Fox. It would be a podcast or a YouTube channel, for example. So, that was something, and maybe it's Spielberg's age that he's a bit out of touch and he doesn't get that that's where things are at now. But that was really, the movie would have been more impressive if that had been a feature. There did seem to be at least a token criticism of the way that vested interests within the deep state and black programs have been gatekeepers of this knowledge, and their time is coming to an end. And although there was no resolution of the film, the feared chaos from disclosure all at once, so-called catastrophic disclosure, didn't seem to play out. It seemed to be a lot more orderly and peaceful, the way that the information was received, and people integrated that into their lives. So far as we could see, there wasn't mass panic. And the way that the antagonists of the film had to back off and drop their weapons, and the way the world stopped, even though World War III was about to break out, all of that seemed to imply that peace as the end result of disclosure would be the scenario that wins out. But again, we didn't get to see that happen. So a few things that were awkward about the film, but it was mildly enjoyable. There were things that it added to the disclosure discussion that's happening right now. But as with all of the other stuff that's going on in the disclosure space and the official disclosure that's happening, there was still a lot to be desired. But when we're looking at it within our own historical context, we can sometimes forget the bigger picture and forget how extraordinary these times really are, that disclosure is happening at all. So let's just remember that as well when we're thinking about this film. So that's my thoughts on Disclosure Day. What do you think? Leave your comments down below. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so you actually get informed when I post future videos. If you want to support me further, you can hit join or thanks down below. And again, I've recently published a book which details my own process of communicating with a higher power and getting messages from it. And so you can get a copy of that book by going to the Amazon link down below as well. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.